Welcome back, everyone, to Radiant Resilience. I am very excited for this conversation today because it is very relevant to some current events at the time that we're recording this. I have with me Zolal Habibi. She is an Iranian human rights activist and a prominent voice for justice, democracy, and women's rights in Iran. She serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, where she advocates globally for a free, secular, and democratic Iran. With over 2 decades of dedicated activism, she has become a fierce advocate on behalf of the voiceless inside Iran, regularly appearing in international forums, human rights conferences, and live broadcasts around major media platforms. Welcome, Zalal. How are you today?
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity and allow me to greet those who are tuning into the podcast today.
Thank you so much for being here. When I saw that our interview was coming up, I was like, wow, this is like going to be probably a pretty intense conversation. So I'm going to let you kind of start wherever you want. I know you have a personal story that leads into all the things that you're doing now. So if you want to maybe start sharing that wherever it feels right for you, and then we'll go from there.
I guess I'll start from where my journey begins with the issue of Iran and human rights in Iran. I am from the generation that was born after the 1979 revolution. So I was actually born abroad. My parents came to the US before the revolution. So I was born in the US. But I got introduced to the human rights situation in Iran very early on. I think I was about 3 days old the first time I went to a demonstration. And
Really?
yeah, my parents were very active. And so it was always part and parcel of my life, even though we weren't in Iran. And, I think I met people who were victims of torture for the
Mm.
first time when I was 4 or 5 years old, because my father was a prominent writer and a human rights activist. We actually had this opportunity that they were staying with us for about 2 weeks, a group of people who had escaped the prisons of the regime. And they became my heroes. They wouldn't tell me like the things that they had been through, of course, since I was only 4. But I remember I kept on pursuing them and asking them, questions, and they're like, she's not supposed to know these things. She's just a child. And at the end of the day, I think I forced one of them to tell me like his story because I had seen so many pictures and posters of him, like even before they visited us, like in different, books or newspapers and whatever. So I knew like a bit about his stories. I remember he told me his story, but like a rated G version of it. And he
Mm.
told me about, how he had a daughter who was like a year older than me. And then he told me about like how he was able to escape prison. They became like, those heroes in my mind, superheroes that, you children grow up with. Mine were real people. And so, I grew up understanding that that's the situation in Iran. And I think that coming face to face with these realities really shaped who I was in a way, but it also made me grow up a lot faster,
Mm.
I guess, than other kids our age because of the things that we're dealing with on day-to-day basis. But I always thought that is in Iran and we're here.
Yeah, it's easy to have that separation when it's that far away. I mean, I think it probably is for a lot of Americans right now to be like, oh, well, it's all happening over there, even though, we're the ones doing stuff and everything. So, yeah. But I'm assuming because your parents were from there that you had family over there still.
Our entire, like all of our family was still in Iran.
Yeah.
I actually never got the chance to like I have aunts and uncles that I've never had the chance to
Mhm.
actually meet to this
Wow.
day, or cousins and everything. But the thing is that in summer of 1988, all of that changed, even for us, because that summer the Iranian regime had my father killed. That summer, 30,000 political prisoners were executed in Iran.
Wow.
And so it wasn't just,
30,000.
yeah. So it wasn't just something that impacted my life that summer, but it was like all of Iran was being impacted that summer with, the killings that were being carried out. And that really just changed everything for us. And from then on, I understood that the regime sees no borders when it comes
Mm.
to its crimes. And, it became real to me because of, my own experience. But at that point, I still didn't consider myself to be like a victim. I still considered myself to be one of the lucky ones because I knew so many others, people my age, who had a worse situation than what we did. First of all, I understood, and I actually didn't take for granted the fact that I was growing up in the US where we were safe, and I understood that, that's not a given.
Mm-hmm.
There are people like my age in Iran who are suffering.
Mm-hmm.
There are people my age in Iran who, like, I had friends who had been taken to prison with their parents. I had and had to watch, like, for instance, their parents being tortured as a method of psychological torture. I had friends who, like, to this day, she remembers that, at the age of 6, she was the only one walking in prison without a blindfold. So she is actually the true witness,
Yeah.
eyewitness of what was going on, because everyone else had a blindfold. They knew what they had suffered. They weren't necessarily seeing what everyone else was going through, but she saw all of that. Or I had a friend, as I said, she actually had to watch her father be tortured. And unfortunately, her father ended up dying under torture, but she was 5 at the time. And she had to, she had blocked it out of her memory, but she would have nightmares about it. I knew people who had those kind of experiences. I also knew people who had, like, lost both their parents, or like their entire family was wiped out. So I understood that, unfortunately, these are the circumstances in our country, but I was still part of the lucky generation to be able to live in a democracy, to be able to have the opportunities that I did, and not to take it for granted. But it also made me become active. I remember, like, going to info booths as a child and wanting to inform people of, this is what's happening in Iran, going with my mom or with others and trying to tell people, look, this is what's happening to children in Iran. Do you need to listen to this? And I just felt like I had to be their voice, And growing up with that, I think, activism was part of life for me. Growing up, I remember, like, spending my spring breaks going to Congress to try to get, members of Congress to sign on to a statement or whatever. And that was normal to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that continued, but it was always like I was doing my studies and doing my, I had my personal life, and then I had a part of it which was dedicated to activism. But that was also, like, what my, everyone in the family, like, pushed me towards, like, you need to concentrate on your studies, you need to become something. I don't know if you know any Iranians, but education is, like, a major issue in our culture. Like,
Mm-hmm.
families don't accept it unless you become, like, a doctor, lawyer,
Yep.
engineer. That's where the bar is set. So I was on that path. I had gotten a full scholarship to study medicine, and that was the life I was pursuing. Then the summer after I graduated from high school, the uprisings broke out in Iran. And this was the first time after over a decade that we were seeing uprisings in Iran. And it was student uprisings, so it was people from, like, our generation, or people who were born after the 1979 revolution,
Yeah.
who were coming to the streets for the first time. And it was also the first time that the world was seeing these images, because it was the start of, like, cable television and cable
Mm-hmm.
news, CNN and whatnot. So I remember, like, waking up, like, 5 a.m. and watching these, reports coming in before going to, it was summer, so I was working during the summer. And I remember thinking to myself, like, what are you going to do? Are you just going to be a bystander and just watch from abroad, like, what is happening in Iran? Or do you have a responsibility, and are you going to do something about it? And that is when I decided to join the Iranian resistance. So I decided to leave that full scholarship and that, college education behind, and join the
Wow.
resistance instead. And I remember, like, a year before that, I had ran into an actual article. It was printed in a youth magazine, but it was in Farsi. Like, it's printed in LA. I think it still exists. It had a report that there were over 20,000 Iranian doctors in the US back in 1997 or 1998. And right now, I think it's like 3, 4 times more than that. At the
Wow.
time, I remember thinking, are you going to be one of those 20,000? Or are you going to be one of those who frees Iran so these 20,000 can actually go and serve their own people? Because even to this day, Iran has the greatest brain drain in the world. And if you look even right now, like, look at Silicon Valley, look at, some of the top Fortune 500s, look at, like, NASA, look at the universities across the US, you see Iranians at the top, the highest levels, but they're not able to serve their own country. They're not
Mm.
able to do anything for their own people, because unfortunately we have a religious dictatorship in power in our country. And so that was the turning point in my life. That was, I guess September or August, September 1999. And
Okay.
to this day, I've been a member of the resistance.
And what does that look like then exactly for you? Like what you said you walked away from a college education, so has this become like sort of a job for you too then or
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is what I've dedicated my life to. I mean, in different eras or I guess different times, it's been 26 years. So it's probably had like different forms and shapes,
yeah.
but it is that, I have dedicated my life to the cause for freedom, be it from working right now in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, working with different lawmakers in different countries or NGOs or whatnot,
Mm.
to draw attention to the situation in Iran, or just in different times it's been like different aspects. There have been times that my work has been mostly concentrated in like in regards to the situation of women in Iran,
Yeah.
or like for instance our youth chapters and youth activism or human rights situation, or just different fronts based on what was needed.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the women's rights over there because I know that's probably a big topic for people. So, and as you've said, it's has that changed over the years or has it always pretty much been the same?
Well, I think it has two fronts. One front is the regime, which is unfortunately has always been this. Um, I think that it's very important, I think, for people to understand like what it's derived from, this misogynist regime that's ruling Iran, and why is one of its pillars, one of its main pillars, is misogynist views. Khomeini knew that to be able to keep a grip on power and on society, he needed to somehow be able to control like half of society. Because once you have a grip over half of society, you could enter the most, personal aspects of people's lives, and you could control all of society. And so that's why one of his first concentrations was on the plight of women, in Iran. We see that just months after the revolution, he tried to have the forced, the compulsory veil enforced
Mm-hmm.
on women. And that was like the first protest that actually formed against Khomeini. And it was on International Women's Day that those protests were held. But it's very important to understand that the women of Iran have never given in to this regime. And I think
Okay.
that's very important to
Yeah.
understand. But the regime, I mean, when they're able to enter with the difference between the Iranian regime and a lot of like other countries or even cultures who might have like more misogynist, unfortunately misogyny is everywhere. I
Mhm.
don't think there's a country that we can say that doesn't have any misogyny in its culture or in their society right now. But the difference between the Iranian regime and other or governments is the fact that these misogynist views are written into law, so
Mm.
they have been legalized and it's systematic. And so it's not a cultural thing,
Right.
it's a law, and that's what makes a major difference. But the women of Iran have always been, I think, front and center in the fight against this regime.
Mhm.
You see that throughout the 1980s, you see that till today, and you see that in the resistance in face of this regime. The world saw in 2022 in the uprisings in Iran after the death of Mahsa Jina Amini for malveiling that, they were awed by the bravery of the women of Iran. But for us, that wasn't something that just, a phenomenon that just happened. This is something that's been brewing in Iran society for decades. And we've seen it. Over 30,000 women have been executed by this regime throughout these years. Just this week, unfortunately, 2 women have been sentenced to execution for participating and taking part in the uprisings in January of this year. And that is continuous. This fight is continuous. And I think that's really important to understand. And the reality is that when women join the fight against the regime, they have to, it's not only that they're fighting the regime, they have to fight a lot more obstacles to be able to even join the movement because, society is more acceptable of their sons maybe getting into a fight than their daughters. And so they have to overcome those obstacles too within their own families or, that household or whatnot. So we have seen the resilience of Iranian women throughout the decades. We have seen that because of this misogynist nature of this regime, when they see defiance from women, it just makes them hysterical even more.
Because they're afraid.
So that's why, yeah, yeah. They are afraid of them because they also, like, for instance, even in the 1980s, you would see that, I mean, if you compare the prisons today and 1980s in Iran, it's not comparable. The amount of like the brutal crimes that were perpetrated back in the 1980s, the regime, it's not like they've distanced themselves from it. They just don't have the capability or the capacity to commit those crimes that they used to, because it's all been revealed in the international arena, and there's been so much pressure, they can't continue to carry out those methods. But back in the 1980s, you saw that, you know, the resilience of women under torture and those situations was at a completely different dimension and level. And that was something that the Iranian resistance was seeing. We also saw, you know, from 13-year-old girls being executed to elderly mothers in their 70s. We saw, you know, pregnant women being executed. We, you know,
for what?
girls,
just for speaking
for
out?
political activism. I mean, some of them, it was like they were arrested in their, you know, college campuses or high school for having a pamphlet or a newspaper. I mean, it could be simple things like that. And also a lot of them is for, you know, family relations too. Like that is something that the regime practices actually. And, you know, we've seen entire families that have been wiped out, including like their, as I said, like 13-year-old child, like Fatima Mesbah. She was 13. She was executed in 1981. Her parents and 3 siblings were all executed. And, you know, that was like a reality that I grew up with. I always knew that the year that I was born, there was this 13-year-old girl who was executed. Her name was Fatima Mesbah. And those stories, you know, just always stayed with us. So we have been seeing that resilience in the prisons of Iran and standing in front of the regime in every aspect. And I think women in Iran have just turned every possibility as a way of resisting against this regime. Like, for instance, in Iran, you see there are more women attending universities than there are men. It's not because there's like positive discrimination for them or anything like that. It's because they see it as a way of resisting against the misogynist regime.
And they are allowed to do that then. They are allowed to go to university. They won't get arrested for that.
No.
That's good.
Regime, I mean, the reality is that women have been fighting for their rights in Iran for over a century. So our women's movement has always been strong. I think it goes back 120 years practically. So this is something that we have a history of standing in face of dictators, be it the Shah or the mullahs or whatever. But women have always played a major role in the movement for freedom in Iran. But I think that, like, for instance, I mean, they try to use everything as a form of defiance in society, be it with, you know, standing in face of the of the forced hijab, or be it with, you know, attending universities, be it with taking part in protests, taking part in the resistance. And that has always been something that has you can see throughout the years or throughout the decades. But also what's important is, I think, this aspect that we don't speak about it as much as we should, just because we are involved in this fight so much. But since 1985, Iranian resistance, specifically when I say that, I mean the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. It's like the biggest organization that is fighting against the regime. They realized the role of women back then in 1985, and they said, look, women are, you know, going far and beyond anything that you could ever imagine, but they're not being represented in the leadership. So they changed their entire system once they realized this, because they're a progressive movement and they're like, you know, we can't have that. And so we have to fight those misogynist, you know, mindsets, or, you know, those gender roles that we have from society with us. So since then, women have played a major role in this movement. And what's interesting is, since 1993, the entire leadership council of this movement have been women. And all the secretary generals of this movement since 1989 till today have been women. And the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran for the interim government after the overthrow of the regime is also a woman. Her name is Maryam Rajavi, and she's the one who leads this movement. And she has really truly been a trailblazer in the issue of women in leadership and equality. And she sees that, emancipation of human beings passes through women's empowerment. You can't have equality, true equality in any society unless you have women's empowerment. And that's not for a specific time period. It might take decades, but you need to have that to be able to reverse these, I don't want to say reverse, but put aside these gender roles that we have, or these biases and these glass ceilings that exist. And as someone who grew up with this movement, I think for me, that was always, this is something I guess I realized later on in life, was that because I grew up with her as like a role model in front of me since I was like, I think when she announced the entire leadership council would be women, I was 12. And so her motto was, we can and we must. And that's like, and I remember using that on like daily basis, even in school or in personal issues. I was like, we can and we must. There's nothing that we can't do. We just have to make that decision and we can do it. And so I grew up with that motto. And I remember like there was a point that I realized like, hey, I don't have a lot of the glass ceilings that my friends do, because I grew up seeing like my mom and like Mrs. Rajavi and others in front of me who had done things that, to this day, no one has even come close to. And so I think that really made an impact on our generation, but also it made its impact inside of Iran too, because even under the censorship and everything, even if you weren't in contact directly with this movement, it creates like that ripple effect in society. And so once there is that precedent, that message goes far and beyond. And that's what we're seeing in, the women of Iran and their determination and steadfastness to bring about change. And Ms. Rajavi always says that it's like a spring. The more pressure you put on a spring, when you take that pressure off, the more potential it has to jump. And that is the potential that we see in the women of Iran today. And the reality is that, unfortunately, because of the regime, they have nothing to lose. So that's why they're willing to take so much risks and to stand in defiance in face of this regime.
It's a lot. And, we only get like bits and pieces, I feel like, in the news of the actual story that's happening over there. So, I mean, it's always one of my favorite things to talk to people who are directly involved and affected and stuff like that. So, I mean, as far as the events of now, like I have a client at work whose husband is from him and his family are from Iran, and I had asked them, I don't know, like, are you happy about what's happening now? Are you like, and it was interesting to hear them say, oh yeah, we're glad that the regime has been overthrown at this point in time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the current events right now.
I think if you look at the current events, like starting from beginning of 2026, uprisings that broke out on December 28th, 2025, it was really, the hay that broke the camel's back situation in Iran. In 2025, there were over 2,200 executions carried out in Iran.
We're just standing up against the government, speaking out.
Yeah, I mean, just like on bogus charges mostly. It's just to spread fear in society, because that's how the regime has been able to keep its grip on power, is by spreading fear. And then there practically isn't a single area in Iran that you could put your finger on that has not been completely destroyed by this regime. The economy, the infrastructures, the environment, I mean, every aspect of life has really fallen apart under this regime. And so the people of Iran were fed up with the situation. And so that's why you saw, people coming to the streets by thousands and thousands, by the millions, against the entirety of the regime. And what we saw in this uprising was how these protests are evolving. If you look in the last decade, we've had 4 major uprisings in Iran. And each time you see it's step by step, and it becoming more radical and more targeted, I guess, the entirety of the regime. Like this regime has to go in its entirety. And the Iranian regime gets that message very clearly. That's why you see, the major crackdown and the bloodshed. Unfortunately, since 2019 till now, each time you see the uprising and then there's an internet blackout where the regime is able to carry out a massacre. Jeez. And that way they're able to push people back into their homes, and then people have to wait for the next spark to come out again. But this time in January, people of Iran, I mean, when you spoke to people, they said it was a different atmosphere. First of all, they said one of the things that was very different this time was you could see hope in people's eyes. And that is very important. They said even though there was the crackdown and the brutalities, you didn't see fear in people's eyes, you saw hope. The other thing is you could see, even in the videos surfacing from the protests, you saw a organized nature in the protests. There were some these groups who would come and lead the protest. They would come and give direction to the protest. And that was the role of resistance units. This is a phenomenon that has come together in the past decade in Iran. It has been led by as I said, the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. They've seen it as the strategy to be able to overthrow the regime. It has to be a combination of having networks that are organized underground and popular uprising and protest, because this regime is not going to just, step aside.
No, of course
not.
It's
a very brutal regime. They're going to kill till the last minute. So you need to be able to have people who are willing to be those vanguards and lead the path, or also protect the protesters. And so that's why we saw this time around that people were on the offensive. They were disarming the suppressive forces. They were protecting one another. They were releasing people who were, they would attack and release those who were detained or things of that nature. So we saw on January 16th and 15th, actually 2-3 cities that were liberated by the people. And so this was people were learning from that. They're okay, this is what we need to do. Especially social media was really helpful in spreading that message and sharing those experiences. And so the next day, the regime shut down the internet completely. And unfortunately, we saw the bloodbath that the regime created. Thousands were killed in January. We don't have exact numbers because the reality is that there was a 19-day internet blackout. And it's very difficult to be able to confirm. We have gathered the names of over 2,600 of the people who had been killed, but we don't have exact numbers. And, that was, the regime thought that they could spread fear that way. Afterwards, they had martial law completely in Iran. But what we saw was people also learned their lessons from these experiences. They're look, this is how the regime goes. We can't go back into our homes now because next time it's going to be more brutal.
Yeah.
So we need to continue. And that was the message inside of Iran. So what we saw is actually a week before the start of the war was the 40th day. In Iran, we have this thing in our culture, when someone passes, they hold ceremonies for them or memorial services 40 days later. And it's the end of the mourning period. So we saw these memorial services being held across Iran. But instead of it being families drowning in their sorrows, you saw them turning into a celebration of their loved one's life and using it to actually make a pledge to them to continue this fight. And so all of those memorial services started turning into kind of acts of defiance in one form or another. And the thing is that because there was martial law, people couldn't come out of their homes for another excuse. So they were using those events. And for a lot of people, that was a parallel to 1979. 1978, 1979, the protests that led to the revolution, it was going from the 40th of there was a demonstration. The Shah opened fire on the demonstrators. The mourning ceremonies for these demonstrators, the 40th day of those ceremonies, they would turn into a protest. The regime would open fire on them again. A few other people would be killed. So this cycle of 40th events is what led to the 1979 revolution. And everyone started seeing those connections there, that resemblance, those parallels. But we had these ceremonies that were being held all across Iran, but they were people coming out in defiance of the regime. And we saw that Monday, it was the Saturday. In Iran, the week starts on Saturdays. February 22nd, so exactly 1 week before the start of the war, universities started resuming their in-person classes because since the uprisings, the regime had shut down all campuses because universities are one of the hotbeds of the protest. The day universities resumed classes in person, protests started across Iran in different universities.
Wow.
And within 3 days, the regime was not able to control those protests. So they said, okay, all classes are going to be online again until April. And so we saw that on February 23rd, so 5 days before the start of the war, we saw an operation that was carried out by 250 members of the resistance units targeting the headquarters of Khamenei, which is like the most secure location in all of Iran, at a time that they were in heightened security because there was fear that the war would start in any day. And they were able to infiltrate the 8,000 security forces controlling this compound. And that had a message for people in Iran. They're like, look, the regime is in much weaker position than we think, but this is the path forward. So we need to be, mobilizing, reorganizing, but from now on, this is going to be the path. The path has to go with, protests. Like there was student protests at that time in the universities, and then there was this operation at the same time. So these two have to work together and balance together to be able to push forward the overthrow of the regime. And that is exactly what the regime feared. Unfortunately, because the war started, it's not possible to do anything on the ground right now due to the circumstances, because when there's bombs over your head, you really have to take shelter. I think for people in Iran on the first day, I doubt you could find anyone in Iran that was not glad that Khamenei has been eliminated, even though this is not how we saw it. We always thought that he would be held accountable for the crimes he's perpetrated. But there's no doubt the regime is in a weaker place, but war is never the solution. With a war does not bring in democracy. Democracy can't be installed in Iran. And that is something that we have as our movement, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, we have reiterated this not just today, but for like 22 years now. We have said always that the solution to Iran is neither war nor appeasement. It's change by the people of Iran for the people of Iran and by their organized resistance. Because from experience, if you look at history, unfortunately, the policy of appeasement leads to a war. That's what happened in World War II. This is what happened. There's so much that you keep on giving into a dictatorship thinking that maybe they'll change their ways, but they're not going to. And then you're going to reach a point that it's a point of no return, and then a war happens. But also Iran, even if you look at it completely from a military perspective, Iran is not Iraq or Afghanistan or any of the other, or Yemen or Libya or anything like that. Iran is about, I think, 3 times the size of Iraq, 4 times the population. And it's not a classical dictatorship. Like, for instance, when you have a classical dictatorship, when you take that dictator out of its position, the system collapses. This regime has an apparatus intact. It has a system. It's supposed to be a republic, so it has those systems intact. So that's why when you remove Khamenei, the system is still there and it's still continuing. And I think that most people just assumed when Khamenei is eliminated, that means the end of this regime. But they forget that when Khomeini died, that did not mean the collapse of the regime. Khamenei stepped in. And today, that's not going to mean the fall of the regime. Of course, it'll be weaker, the same way that when Khomeini died and Khamenei came into his place, it became weaker than it was in the 1990s, but it doesn't mean necessarily the end of the regime. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is also, like, for instance, if you look at it, like, as I said, from a military perspective, Iran, because it's not going to fall when you have the dictator remove that one person, the system is intact. Iran is a very large country. With bombing alone, you can't have this regime fall apart because it's a very large country. On the other hand, like, for instance, we have, if you want to bring troops on the ground, it's not very likely. Iran, as I said, it's very large. Also, we have desert. We have the different terrains. We have mountains. We have jungles. We have very busy metropolitan areas. So it's not something that's very practical to do. Yeah. And the regime knows that. Other countries know that. So that's why at the end of the day, the regime is, easily rested that they know that there isn't going to be a full-fledged war, as in troops on the ground. And we have the experience of the 8-year war with Iraq too. On the other hand, Iran is the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism. So unfortunately, that comes into play. The war is not limited just to Iran's borders. Unfortunately, we've seen 12 other countries were attacked by the Iranian regime during this war. And war is not, there are certain images that you just see on television and on the internet. The realities of war are much more extreme. it comes with, there's collateral damage, I guess you could say, no, but it's much more than that. I mean, war comes with its destructions, and it comes with, it takes a toll on infrastructure, on the people, on civilians. There are a lot of casualties on all ends. So it's not so black and white. You can't just be like, okay, well, these people are eliminated, so are you happy? I don't think any country or any people want to see their own country bombed. And the infrastructure is destroyed. They're not like, even I think the US president said it'll take like over 100 years to rebuild some of them, but also some, like even some of the places, historic places that were targeted. I mean, they were from 700 years ago and whatnot.
Man.
And so there have been destructions there too, but also like just I think civilian casualties, and more than anything else, our greatest asset is our people. You don't want that destroyed. But I think
There's
that
no
is
way
why.
that innocent people don't end up in the crossfire of war. And yeah, that's awful.
And I think that's why, like, people are like, well, do you want to see regime change? We want to see regime change, but not through war. I think the people of Iran have the potential to bring about that change, and they have that capability. But the reality is that till now, because some people ask, I've had people ask me, they're like, well, you say that you should allow the people of Iran to take their destiny into their own hands. Well, you guys haven't been able to overthrow this regime till today. But the reality is that you're not taking into consideration that till today, there has been a positive appeasement toward this regime. And those used as the bargaining chips at the table, at the negotiation table with this regime over these decades, have been the Iranian people and their resistance, especially their organized resistance. So it hasn't been a very, equal grounds in this fight. But right now, what's important is recognize the people of Iran's right to resist and fight back, and allow them to take that destiny into their own hands. Because you also have to understand, in Iran, we have, if you look in the last century, we have the experience of foreign intervention. Unfortunately, all of the dictators that we've had in place have been installed in our country. The first was like Reza Khan, when he started the Pahlavi dynasty. It was through a military coup that the British were behind, because it would meet their interest in regards to Iran's oil and whatnot. So we had that. And then when he wasn't, serving their purposes anymore, they had him taken out because he had the leniency towards Hitler and all of that. They took him out and brought in his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who's known to everyone as the Shah. And so at the beginning, he was very hesitant because he knew that his father had been taken out, so he had to watch his steps, I guess. And so that was the time that the people of Iran were able to, bring about, like, because they were asking for, if we're going to have a monarchy, at least have a constitutional monarchy, have a prime minister that's elected, not selected. So the only democratic government that we had was Dr. Mossadegh, who was the elected prime minister of Iran, and he nationalized Iran's oil. And that was not to the benefit of, Western powers. And so unfortunately, there was a coup d'etat against him by the CIA and MI6, and he was taken out after 2 years. And after that, the Shah ruled with the iron fist, the savak, the executions, the tortures, and everything, until he was overthrown. But even though he was overthrown through a popular uprising and the people were able to remove him from power, unfortunately, what came after was not what the people of Iran had bargained for. At the time, it was a Cold War era. So, Iran is bordering the USSR. And at the time, the world was, watching like what's going to happen in the Middle East, because Iran plays a very important geopolitical role. If you look, like, for instance, if something happens to in Iran, you see its ripple effect in the region. Like, for instance, once Dr. Mossadegh nationalized oil, you saw these nationalistic movements forming in the Middle East and Egypt and everywhere else based on what happened in Iran. And also we saw when Khomeini came into power and he brought Islamic fundamentalism, you see the growth of Islamic fundamentalism in the world. So in the region especially. So that is something that they were thinking about. And at the time there was a conference in France, in Guadeloupe, and they decided, the Western leaders, that those who had created the revolution were people with progressive, mindsets, or like from progressive movements. They're like, so we're not sure what direction they're going to take the country in. But Khomeini, he is a religious figure, so he's against communism. And because he's fundamentalist, actually not a religious figure, but he had these backward mindsets. So maybe he is to our benefit to have him in power. And he made promises to the West. He said, yeah, I will give people their freedoms or whatever. I'm just going to go and continue my studies in Rome. I don't want to have anything to do with power. I'm not seeking power or whatnot. I'll just be like a father figure because I'm this old man, right? And unfortunately, he came and he never left Tehran. And this is what we're suffering from till this day. So the people of Iran have that experience. And so they're like, no, thank you. We can create change ourselves, but allow us to. And so I think that's why you see like in the protest or, especially among the youth, like the Gen Z of Iran, you have to understand Iran's population, over 70% of our population are under the age of 30.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's a very young population. And one of their main slogans, like neither the crown nor the turban, freedom and democracy. Okay. So our choices are not choosing between the current regime and the previous one, which was also a dictatorship, but a classical one. They want to move forward to a secular democratic republic. So, secular being not a theocracy, democratic being not a dictatorship, and republic not being a monarchy. So that is like what we're seeking, and that is what the people of Iran are striving for. Because there are those who have interest in Iran, and like, for instance, there are some who are promoting like the return of the Shah. The people of Iran are not in the business of recycling dictators right now. They kicked them out for a reason,
And it sounds like all of these dictators have been kicked out. So why would you want to bring them back? Man, it's a totally different world over there, really. And like we talked about earlier, having the separation of location is crazy. So it's so easy to just push it aside. How long was this current regime in power then?
It's 47 years now.
Jesus. Wow. Okay. So what do you see, or what are you working towards now? I mean, there's the war happening at the moment. Is there an end in sight for that, to where like could the international governments try to get together with the Iranian people to try to put together the actual democracy they're looking for? Or I don't know, what does the future look like at this point? I know it's probably still very uncertain, but what do you see as somebody who's kind of like involved and on the inside?
I think that the regime always gives the solution, or like the path forward itself, from what they fear and what they react to. Unfortunately, in the past 2 weeks, we witnessed the execution of 14 people, 6 political prisoners who were executed, and 7 protesters who were executed in Iran. Their age range went from 18 to, I think, 69 or 68 years old. But it was giving a message that even in the time of war, the regime can't stop executions, because it knows that at the end of the day, it's going to be overthrown by the people of Iran. And in their media, they have been repeating, like last week, Ejei, who is the head of the judiciary, came to the scene and said, we need to expedite the execution processes for, political prisoners and the protesters, because this is the experience that they have from 1988. 1988, that I told you that 30,000 people were executed, it was right after the end of the Iran-Iraq War. And he knew that he had suppressed everything internally for 8 years by saying, like, you need to keep quiet. We have a foreign enemy and we're at war and whatnot. And once that was removed, that smoke screen of the war was removed, he knew that there's going to be uprising. He knew that people are going to come to the streets. They want to overthrow this regime in its entirety. So what did he do? He had a massacre. In 5-6 weeks, they had 30,000 people executed. So every family at that time, they either knew someone who was executed, or they had lost a loved one. And that with that, they could spread fear in society. In the last year, the regime has been repeatedly saying this in their media, that we need a repetition of 1988 to keep our grip on power. Even after the uprisings in January, they said Khavaran is, there's a mass grave in Tehran. It's called Khavaran, and it's very well known. It's a mass grave from the 1988 massacre. One of the regime's officials said, we need a Khavaran in every province of Iran if we want to keep our grip on power. So this regime has been saying, this is what we need to be able to keep our grip on power, because they know at the end of the day, they're not going to be overthrown with, bombings or whatever. They know they're going to be overthrown by the people of Iran. But on the other hand, we see the defiance of the Iranian people. And I think that the fact that there is a clear roadmap, just to give you a feel for it, in the past year, in 2025, these resistance units that I told you about, they carried out 13,000 awareness campaigns throughout Iran. So they were raising awareness and keeping the flame of resistance alive and hope in people. And I think that's really important under a dictatorship like the regime. And they carried out 4,092 operations against centers of oppression. You know, those tied in together, it's showing like the direction that people are going to. And among them, you see, like, for instance, just in the uprisings in January, over 2,000 members of resistance units are currently unaccounted for. They've probably been either arrested or killed, but we don't have that information. Their names have been provided to the international community. So when that happens, you understand like how extensive this network is, that 2,000 are just like, you know, unaccounted for right now. Yeah. And the regime knows that too. And so that is what they fear the most. And I think that the Iranian resistance has put forth a plan for an interim government. The National Council of Resistance of Iran is a parliament in exile with over 500 members, has like 25 different committees. They have worked on the plan for the provisional government since 1981. And they have withstood the test of time. I mean, the fact that this parliament in exile was formed in 1981, in July 1981, and still stands today, that within itself is something that people of Iran can trust, because it has withstood the test of time, and it has shown what it stands for through not just mere words or in writing, but with their own, you know, actions and their practices. I mean, when they say, like, for instance, we believe in, you know, gender equality, you see that 52% of this parliament in exile are women, and the president-elect is a woman. When it calls for the abolition of the death penalty in a free Iran, they're the ones who have been executed the most under both the current regime and the previous one, and they're the ones who are like, look, this cycle of death and destruction has to come to an end. That is not justice to you have no right to take away someone's life, right? They're calling for independent judiciary. They're calling for separation of religion and state. And you see it in their own practices on a daily basis. So that is what the people of Iran know that they can trust. It calls for a non-nuclear Iran, but they're the first who revealed Iran's nuclear program to the world 20-something years ago. I think those all stand, like, they're the merits that you can count on. And we see their network inside of Iran too. So I think that that is the way forward. The people of Iran, the Iranian resistance has always emphasized on its independence. We don't ask for, we're not asking for financial support. We're not asking for weapons. We're not asking for troops on the ground. None of that. We think that we have the capability and the potential to bring about that change. We're just asking for the international community to actually stand by the people of Iran, stop appeasing the mullahs. And, you know, you have to understand, we read between the lines. So does the regime. I mean, the fact that these executions that I told you in the last, 10 days, you see international organizations like Amnesty or even the UN Human Rights Commission making statements about it, but there's yet one government to make a stance on it. Say, we condemn these executions that are taking place in the time of war, but because they are in negotiations in regards to the war, everyone is turning a blind eye on the executions to try to come to some kind of terms with the regime. But the regime gets that message. They're like, oh, okay, so that's why we have to expedite the executions, because right now no one's going to care what we do. And this is what we need to be able to suppress the situation internally. The people, the regime reads between the lines, so do we. It's time for the international community to stand by the people of Iran. Like right now, unfortunately, it is I've practically lost count. I think today is day 45 of the internet blackout in Iran. Since the first day of the war, people have not had internet access. That is something that the international community can provide. And if they do that, some of the realities will come out, but that is not being done. So these are the type of things that I think that the world can do to support the people of Iran. And it's not at a very high cost for them, but this is the path forward if we want to see a true stable democracy in Iran, which will hopefully have, its ripple effect. Also, it would be good to see Iran as a stabilizing force in the region instead of being the destabilizing force in the
Yeah.
region. I think it would put an end to a lot of the warmongering and the crisis we see in the region if we are able to change things in Iran, which I think that we will be able to do so soon.
I hope so. So how can, if any of my listeners want to help in any capacity, what do you recommend?
Well, there's a few things that I think everyone can do. First of all, raise awareness and become more aware yourself. You could visit ncr-iran.org or to learn more, and also mariamrajavi.com, and or like mariamrajaviforchange.com. I could give you all of those so you have those
Those all in the
information.
notes.
And but if you would like to get involved, because there's a lot of different activities that are being carried out by the Iranian diaspora right now. So if you could, like for instance, if you're in the US, reach out to Organization of Iranian American Communities. It's oiac.org. They have chapters in 40 different states, so you're probably covered there. And they have a lot of activities both on Capitol Hill, but also like locally. They have exhibits, they have protests, they do a lot of work locally too. So reach out to them. We appreciate every single type of help that we can get. If you are outside of the US, you could reach out to iranfreedom.org and they will put you in contact with local chapters wherever you are in these critical times.
Well, I think that the work you're doing is pretty amazing, and I can't believe you've been doing it for 20 plus years too. That's amazing. But yeah, so thank you so much for are these links that you gave me on here for being in touch with you? It looks like maybe you're LinkedIn.
And if anyone wants to directly contact me, I am available on Instagram, X, and LinkedIn if you search my name. So.
Well, my friend, do you have any parting words for my listeners that you want to leave them with after all of this?
I guess is never underestimate the role that you can play. And we have to be the change that we want to see in society. So, take it upon yourself and don't just be a bystander. Try to do in whatever area. It doesn't have to be on Iran, but stand for what you believe is right. And because that is what, we're all agents of change at the end of the day. And as Mrs. Rajavi says, we can and we must bring about that change that we want to see.
Yes. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And thank you for this conversation. I feel like it brought about a lot more awareness and education. And I hope that people listening learned something too about what's happening now and, what happened before and all of the things. So thank you so much for being a light in this world.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Zalal. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you on the next episode.